that people always go to the closest one.
Oh yeah, gotta go closest to the door.
But let me actually text Michael to bring his blood, or he can take it out. Well, if they can do it, if they can do it, then you don't have to worry about it. Hey, good. How are you, Ryan? Welcome. You just sign in, and then there's also a fact sheet for this, so we'll take it on the way out. Yeah. So on the actual, so when
Welcome to AT Com.
especially to the and part on yeah, am I saying right?
Beautiful.
How are you? Good, good. Excited.
Yeah. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time, probably, but it's good that it's here.
Yeah, that's very exciting. It's never
Whatever you want.
anywhere. Start a new one, so. Everyone doesn't clear out. How have you been?
Good. Do you know Daniel?
No, I don't. I'm Becky. Nice to meet
Becky.
you.
Daniel's our research assistant.
Oh, awesome.
He joined a couple weeks ago now, right?
Yeah. Are you here for the summer or through the fall or? Okay. Oh, exciting. Yeah, it's almost August.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Time's going
I know.
by fast.
Is our research assistant.
You did.
August.
Yeah.
Almost. It's crazy. Yeah, where do you go to school?
Hi, welcome. How are you?
Oh, okay, great. This is not very far, is it? I didn't see here.
Yes.
Good. You can take like the outcome. No, that's like a kid.
Yeah, I'm still working.
Yeah.
The only thing we also have to
How's it going? No, well, yeah. Can you, what was your name? Yeah. I knew it started with an E. I can't remember that. I can't remember.
True.
Yeah, because that was like a mix. So it's part presentation and part panel and part discussion. Yeah. Yeah, they were big. Wow. Yeah, they're good.
Yeah. In the beginning, I might just put it here with you to introduce, because I need to be there.
Actually.
Either that or I can take that one.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think maybe Susan and Oak and Bill and Sarhang would get the tables, or would you rather them up here with you? What would you prefer?
They can be.
You're fine with?
It's you.
No, it's what
Like
you're
whatever.
comfortable with.
They can be here.
You think? Okay, that's fine.
I don't have a problem.
Okay, perfect. So that's fine.
It's
So
also
then I'll just
if
use
they
the
wanna
mic,
be
because
able
there's
to
not enough.
see this.
That's the thing,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
So we can then just, they can sit, and then when it's time, we can call them up. So
Yeah.
they can see it. You're right, yeah, otherwise they'll be following from your screen.
Yeah.
Okay, this sounds good.
Hi. How are you? Good. Good.
The following participant has entered the conference.
Could you sign in, please?
Yeah, anyway, but here this rain is real down after the summer. It's horrible. It's been raining since last week. Hopefully the weather is much better over there.
The following participant has entered the conference.
Karina.
Turn down the it's very cold. Yeah.
Karina.
Okay, thanks. This is really good for like reflection and like pulling all my notes and all of it from the past. I think after all of this is done, I'm going to sit down with Ryan. Can you all just give this project one name? They're different names there. So like with the lake chapters and that's that's what CSO calls and that's where they have money to came from getting their projects. Like they do all the things in lake chapters and council and we call it modern government or government. Sometimes we go in and lake chapters
Good afternoon, everybody. If we could take your seats, please, so we can get started. That'd be great. Thank you. So welcome to our fifth, I think, learning exchange. I'm Christiane Farki. I'm using a mic because we're recording the session so that folks at our field office can listen in. It's being live streamed right now, and we're also having a recording for those that couldn't participate today. But we're super excited to be hosting this session today, looking specifically at the Nigeria midterm evaluation. But we'll also have a panel discussion with Bill Taylor and Sarhang Hamsaid on how our work is looking to influence policy level discussions. So we're going to first look at the Northern Nigeria Governors Project, and Oge Onumbugu is going to give a presentation. Then Susan Stigant, Director of Africa Programs, will facilitate the panel, and we'll ask Sarhang and Bill to come up for that portion. And then we'll end with small group work, where we're going to be providing some recommendations to the Nigeria team based on what we're hearing today. And there'll be a question there that will prompt you, and we'll have some good small group work as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Oge to share with you the findings of the midterm evaluation, as well as give you some overview of the Nigeria project and our work there. Thank you.
Thanks, Christiane, and thanks everyone for being here today. Before I go through the slides, let me acknowledge all the members of the Nigeria team who are in the room here today. So Emily Fornuff, Jude Muta, and Chris is running behind. But we also have in DC this week, Dr. Chris Kwaja, who is our senior advisor based in Nigeria, is around this week. So it's wonderful having him here to bring the perspective of not only being a USIP staff person, but also a member of the working group, which I'll reference in the presentations. I also want to acknowledge our colleagues who are in our office in Abuja, Thomas, Tefa, and Oluchi, who probably tried to call in today, but because of the time difference, were unable to participate. And I also want to acknowledge Susan as well, who has been with us from the very beginning, pushing this forward. So before I go into an overview of the findings from the review, I think it's important for us to look at the current situation in Nigeria and where things currently stand. On your tables, you all would have already gotten the most updated copy of our fact sheet on Nigeria. And so basically, why Nigeria? Why engage in Nigeria? We know that Nigeria is a priority country for USIP, but just looking at the population size of Nigeria, we're currently at a little over 190 million people and counting, given the figures that we have. But by 2050, Nigeria is actually going to overtake, by the estimates that we see, Nigeria is going to overtake the United States as the third most populous country in the world. Apart from that, Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa. More than half of its population is below the age of 30. And until recently, if you all have been following the news recently, Nigeria also just recently overtook India. We're having the largest number of people living below the poverty line as well. So very important reasons to continue to engage in this country. So if we look at the timeline in Nigeria, the transition to civilian rule in Nigeria happened in 1999. So it's fairly young when it comes to looking at democratic development. And in 2015, we had a sort of a landmark election in Nigeria in 2015 where President Muhammadu Buhari was elected into office. This was the first peaceful transfer to an opposition candidate in Nigeria. And those elections really raised hopes, citizens' hopes. But unfortunately, the Buhari administration has been unable to meet a lot of those expectations. So a lot of challenges still remain, and insecurity concerns are really on the rise. A lot of the factors that continue to fuel violent conflict in Nigeria still remain unaddressed. So when we look at our programs, looking at 2018, going into 2019 and beyond, there are two conflict dynamics in Nigeria today that have the potential, some of them have already turned violent, but have the potential of also being politicized over the next 2 years. We have general elections coming up in February 2019. Elections in Nigeria are always a period of concern, which is why there was a lot of attention in 2015 when there was the peaceful transfer of power. USIP has just recently concluded an elections violence risk assessment as part of our overall programming in Nigeria. Once that report is out, we will definitely share with everyone in the room. I encourage you all to take a look at that report once it's done. Another concern is the increasing insecurity that we see in the country as a result of growing conflicts between farmers and pastoralists in Nigeria. There's intercommunal violence is on the rise as well, and there's also banditry and the lingering threats from Boko Haram. The map that you see over there basically shows you the 36 states of Nigeria, and these actually show you incidents of violent conflict amounting to killings from January of this year to June 2018. So in that space of time, we've had more than 1,000 people killed. And if you look at the three states, Yobe, Borno, and Adamawa, the three states in black, those are the three states that are most affected by the Boko Haram insurgency. But we've seen that other threats of insecurity from farmer pastoralist conflicts have actually claimed more lives this year than Boko Haram. So thinking about the problem in Nigeria, as we look at all the political and socioeconomic challenges, one common thread comes up in all discussions about Nigeria. It's a failure of governance. There's a large disconnect between citizens in Nigeria and those who have been elected to make decisions. The picture over there is from the Occupy movement in Nigeria that launched in 2000. That started in 2012. It was actually fascinating to see this because I was actually in Nigeria at this time when the movement started, and it was all 36 states. Everyone joined in the movement to basically protest against corruption and government mismanagement. I was actually flying in from Cameroon to Nigeria when the protests broke out, and we were stuck mid-air because the airlines had also joined the strike, so we couldn't land. So we were flying around for 40 minutes waiting to land, but it was amazing to actually get there and see everyone take to the streets in Nigeria to protest bad governance. So the failure of governance and the disconnect between government officials and citizens continues to be the thread that weaves all of this together. So in 2015, we started conversations about how we could explore and develop a focused and sustained program in Nigeria. USIP has been engaged in Nigeria for close to 20 years. And the last project that we had there was in 2005 when the Institute did some work with the Imam and the pastor that led to the signing of the Yelwa Shandam Agreement and the documentary, The Imam and the Pastor, which I think everyone at USIP knows about. So that was in 2005. In 2015, we started conversations about how we could develop a program. We had consultations in DC and in Nigeria, and I think this is a very important point that I really want to point out, is that a lot of our work in Nigeria is really done with the support of Nigerian partners, of Nigerian organizations, because they did a lot in feeding into the design of the program of the project from the very beginning. In those consultations, we saw the feedback that we got from civil society actors and actors here in the US as well, was that it was important to address the underlying divisions and governance challenges that create the environment for groups like Boko Haram to emerge and continue to thrive. So in designing our approach, we also had conversations with state governments, with policymakers at the federal government level, and with civil society actors. And there were three things that came out in those conversations that these policymakers said that they would like to see in a project from USIP. They wanted to get more understanding of enhanced analysis and understanding of the issues that the conflict issues that actually affect their different states, and USIP has been able to connect them with different research and civil society organizations as well to help pursue this. They also wanted to see more strengthened connections among state-level policymakers, so amongst the different governors from the different states who may all have similar challenges, how are they working together to address these challenges, and then also strengthening the connections between the policymakers and citizens, and civic actors as well. There was also an interest in looking at sustained skills to address the underlying causes of conflicts, not only sustaining those skills, but looking at institutions of government that exist already at the state level or at the national level, and how the capacity of those institutions could be strengthened to address this. So in all our conversations and in all our consultations in Nigeria, we decided to focus on state governments. Why state governments? In Nigeria, Nigeria is operates a federal system of government. And to be able to understand or go through the process of conflict resolution or peace building, it's important to understand the critical relationship between the central government in Abuja and the 36 state governments. Constitutionally, the state governors in Nigeria have a lot of power, and they control a lot of territory too as well. So for instance, if we take, for instance, Lagos State over there, the population size in Lagos State is over 21 million people. The population size in all of Senegal is about 21 million people. Even in the two states that we focus in Plateau State, in the Middle Belt, in Plateau and Kaduna State, the population in both of those states are pushing close to 4 million people each. Populations in Togo, Benin Republic, and some other smaller West African countries, this is more than half of the population in those countries. You take, for instance, a state like Rivers State, where their budget in 2012 was actually more than the budget of some countries in West Africa. So it's very important to focus at a level where you had policymakers that were able to reach, or to some extent closer to the people, than focusing all the efforts at the national level, but still trying to make sure that as we engage at the state level, we're creating those connections to the national as well. So in 2015, I was just telling Christiane that putting this presentation together was actually a very good time for reflection, because I found a picture on my phone from Andy Bloom in 2015 when we were working on the theory of change for this project, for this project together. So it was nice to reflect and actually pull out those old pictures from the conversations that we had. So the theory of change, for us, we basically thought, and as we came together from the findings from our consultations and different discussions, that if we invest as USIP in state-level capacity to address the different critical conflict drivers through capacity building with state and civic actors, bringing them together for legitimate and transparent conversations and consensus building, then these stakeholders, those that we've targeted, will effectively leverage their influence, relationships, knowledge, and skills in the pursuit of preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. And the chances of collaborative policymaking is actually better if we're able to bring these two actors together. So this has been sort of the guiding, which has really guided our work and guided our engagement and interaction with the state actors, in this case, the state governors and state policymakers, and the civic actors, in this case, the working group that we brought together as part of the project. So in 2015, we came up with 4 objectives for this project. 3 of the objectives were more programmatic focus, and 1 objective was really focused on convening US and Nigerian leaders, because we also saw that there was a gap there in trying to raise awareness around the main issues that were really driving the conflict and driving the emergence of Boko Haram and other groups like Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria. We realized that there was a gap there. So one of the objectives that we identified was to try to convene or bridge that gap between US policymakers and Nigerian policymakers, especially those coming from the northern part of the country. I highlighted the 3rd objective there. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it's on the screen for you. I highlighted the 3rd objective there because these objectives we developed in the first phase of the project, which was from 2015 to 2016. In 2016, when we went in, the project was renewed for a 2nd year in 2016. And that 3rd objective, we focused the second year on objective number 3, because in the first year we had identified the governors, worked with the governors, brought them together in the symposium. We'd also identified the different civic actors, brought them together, created the working group. Now in the second phase of the project, it was up. We had to start bringing those two groups together to strengthen the coordination and collaboration between those groups. So that's where we are at now with the second phase of the project. So I think with us, just to keep in mind of where this project is coming from, this timeline basically outlines where we were in 2000, basically where we started from. In 2005, that was the last main project USIP had in Nigeria. In 2014, we had convened a meeting, or USIP had convened a meeting of some state governors here in 2014. That was right before the 2015 elections. And after the 2015 elections, at least 60% of those governors who came here in 2014 were voted out of office. So there was a lot that we learned from the engagement in 2014. One key thing that we learned from the engagement in 2014 was that it's important to create not create might not be the right word, but it's important to engage citizens in Nigeria to be able to continue the engagement with elected policymakers even after they come here to Washington, D.C. So that was one thing that we learned from the engagement in 2014, and it really helped us as we started our conversations to launch the project. So we signed the IAA for this project in July of 2016. But one thing that I really want to highlight there is that in February 2016, we were able to use the base funds that we had for USIP, for our Nigeria program. I think our base funds were 40,000. I think that was what we had for Nigeria, but we were able to use those base funds. We had a senior leadership visit to Nigeria in February 2016, and also convened a roundtable with civil society actors to start helping us think through the process of the individuals to identify for the working group, and also think through some of the potential objectives, prospective objectives for the for this project. So we were able to do that with base funding before we signed the IAA in July 2016. And I think another interesting thing about this project is that we developed the proposal and basically shopped it around to the different interagency groups. They didn't come to us with the idea. We came up with the idea and went to them with the idea. So we took a different approach here. The working group was created in September 2016, and in October 2016, we hosted the state governors here in Washington, D.C. We hired one staff person in Abuja in 2016 to help in coordinating the activities of the senior working group. The working group actually met for the first time in February 2017. And in May of 2017, the working group started, they had a meeting with the Plateau State Peacebuilding Agency, which is one of the agencies that the state governor from Plateau State had identified, or rather created and identified as a possible vehicle where his administration could continue to work through to address some of the drivers of conflict in the state. And some of the state governors who were at the symposium in October of 2016 actually identified that model as something that they could possibly implement in their own states as well. So the working group undertook a learning visit to the peace agency in Plateau State and came out with some recommendations, which they also shared with the other governors. There was also a focus group component of this project. We did some work with Peace Tech Lab and some work as well with some local actors on the ground to help us really identify who citizens go to first in times of conflict. And the results that came back from the Peace Tech Lab research and from the research with civil society organizations was that citizens often turn to their community or local leaders first in times of conflict. And we took these findings as well, and the working group shared these findings with the governors. The working group came to Washington, D.C. in September 2017, but before that, in August of 2017, we had launched the midterm review for this project. And I actually wanted to acknowledge Ruben, who is in here, because Ruben, basically, we've adopted him on the Nigeria team. He comes to all our Thursday meetings that we've set up for this IAA, and he basically led that process of pushing for the midterm review and tracking the process and making sure that everyone was doing what they were supposed to do, basically. In October 2017, as we started seeing the senior working group taking on more ownership of the project and more ownership of the objectives that had been outlined, they changed their name on their own from the senior working group to the Nigeria Working Group on Peace Building and Governance, because they also wanted to show that this was not just a group of citizens that represented the views of the North, but they represent the views of all Nigeria, and that the conflict issues that we see in northern Nigeria are actually reflected across the country. And I think from the map that I showed earlier, in 2015, when we were talking about violent conflict in Nigeria, everybody was focused on the states affected by Boko Haram. But we've actually seen that we've had more casualties in the last 2 years now from other incidents of violent conflict and not Boko Haram. So it was important for them to send that message. In November 2017, we signed the IAA, or rather renewed for the second phase of the program, of the project, and in December, we completed the midterm review. So we had some preliminary findings in December that we could share with the members of the working group and share with our partners at State CSO and some of the other interagency partners as well that had showed some interest in the project, along with our colleagues at the country level, at the embassy level, and at the USAID level too as well, who follow the project very closely. In January of 2018, the working group continued to take on more independence, and they actually put out their own memo looking at pastoralist farmer conflicts in Nigeria. As part of that process of looking at pastoralist farmer conflicts in Nigeria, they also started a review of different state peace-building mechanisms. And Chris is here. This is Dr. Chris Kwaja, who is our senior advisor in Nigeria and also a member of the working group. And Chris is one of the members of the working group who is spearheading that process of looking at different state peace-building mechanisms in Nigeria, because that's one area of interest for the governors, trying to see what they can do at the state level to address conflict before it escalates. In March of 2018, or before March of 2018, after we signed for the second phase of the project, in February, we brought on 3 new staff people in Abuja. While we do not have a physical office in Abuja, we partner with a Nigerian-based organization, the Center for Democracy and Development West Africa, CDD West Africa. They're based in Abuja, and our staff members are able to work out of their office, and they have a physical location to conduct meetings if they have to. And also the members of the working group are able to come to CDD's office if they have meetings, for their monthly meetings. In April of 2018, we had our second senior leadership visit to Nigeria. Nancy went out to Nigeria in 2018, and she went out with our VP, Mike Yaffe, to see how much we had, the developments from 2016, when last year was there, to today. And so it was actually when she was out there in April, the memo that the working group had written on pastoralist farmer conflicts was actually adopted at an ECOWAS ministerial meeting. So it was actually nice to see USIP playing a role in convening and bringing this group together, the group beginning to take on and become more independent, and now putting out a memo that is adopted at a regional level. So it was nice to see this happen. And then in July, the working group participated in, the working group also met again in July and also participated in the launch of our Elections Violence Risk Assessment report. And they've also started their strategic planning process. So I think it's wonderful that this meeting is happening here now, because the working group in Nigeria is also undergoing their own strategic planning process to think about their plans for the coming years. So I'm going to wrap up really quickly, and I'm just going to talk about the third phase of the project. So we've made some initial changes to the project design based on some of the preliminary findings that have come back from the midterm review, our engagement with our partners at CSO and other interagency groups, and also feedback from our civil society partners in Nigeria, especially the working group. Phase 3 of the project also reflects the changing dynamics that we see in Nigeria with the elections coming in 2019 and the increase in insecurity. And then we've also, for the next phase of the project, we've also proposed an expansion to 2020, because with elections in 2019 next year, and our key partners, one of our key focal partners being the governors, some of these state governors may not remain in 2019. So it's really important for us to think long-term about what happens after the elections with the new governors coming into office, and how the senior working group or the working group will be able to have some face time with them or some level of engagement with them once they're just coming into their new positions as governors. And I want to end it here with saying that in this phase of the project, this is where we are really at a point where we are beginning to look more strategically at how we strengthen the connections between the working group and the state governors. Because it's really important that there is that collaboration that goes not only from the part of the working group to the governors, but from the governors to the working group as well. Because at that point, they will be able to work collaboratively in the policymaking process. And I want to leave us with some questions here as we go into the next session and hopefully the group discussions at the end. One of the things we're really looking at is trying to see if there are other experiences here in USIP or elsewhere that those of you in the room, we're really trying to tap from your expertise here. If there are other platforms that are similar to the working group that you think we could learn from, and if there are things that we could learn from to sustain and support the work of the working group in Nigeria. And also one question that we've kind of struggled with from the beginning of this project is because a lot of our interventions are at the policy level, where we're really looking at the policy making process and big issues that really affect big policy processes and policy-making issues. To what extent should USIP be identified in this process? And how do we keep that balance to ensuring that a policy-making process is independent and country-led? So I'm going to end it over there, and I know I went over, sorry.
It's okay. Thanks, okay. I think that's really helpful as a starting point for people who aren't as familiar with the program. So let me invite Bill and Sarhag to come up, and we'll shift to the panel conversation. I know that people probably have questions, but I suggest we wrap those in. We've also got members of the Nigeria team strategically across the different tables. So in the discussion period, if you have questions or clarifications, let's wrap those into that part of it. So I think Oge has laid out some of the core questions that we're really interested in diving into today. So before we go into getting your lessons learned and insights, I wonder if I can ask us to shift geographies briefly and just hear very briefly about the fundamental problem that you're trying to address in Ukraine, just in maybe a short 2 or 3, your elevator speech of the problem, so that we can contextualize it with the different approaches and where there may be lessons learned across. So maybe we'll start with you, Bill, and we'll ask you to use the microphone for those on.
Glad to do it. And I will give you the context. And then, as I understand it, the topic here today is how to use this, how to transfer the lessons that we've learned, how to transfer what we've done into policy somewhere. So if I can add a minute on my time.
You can do it, absolutely.
I'll now use it. So yes, we're going to shift geography. Ukraine is at the center of a war. There's a war in Europe right now. And you're talking about how many people died in Nigeria. Well, 10,000 Ukrainians have died in the middle of Europe in this century, in the last 3 years. So this is a serious war that USIP ought to have some role in, and indeed we do. You'll be happy to know that we do. Steve Hadley, our board chair, really took the initiative and called Nancy and me up and said, we should do something about this. This is a serious business, and USIP is supposed to be in the business of resolving conflict. Well, what are you doing about this? So we pulled together in really a senior track 2 dialogue. Track 2 meaning it's not the government. Track 1, of course, everybody knows, is the government-to-government dialogue. Track 2 is a level below that. Non-government, but in our case, really closely connected to our respective governments. So we pulled together very senior people, ex-government officials in Ukraine, very senior people, ex-government officials in Russia, together with senior Americans who had done work in both Russia and Ukraine. And we had the Germans and the French because they're part of this discussion in Europe. We got together 2 times. First in last September and then again in February. The first time we kind of came up with an agreed plan, something that the Russians could agree to, the Ukrainians could agree to, we could agree to, the other Europeans, on how to get the Russians out of Ukraine. So as we know, the Russians have illegally occupied, annexed and occupied Crimea. Crimea was not the focus of the discussion, but then they also have invaded and are continue to stir up fighting that have killed 10,000 people, I'll say again, in the southeastern part of Ukraine, and they're still there. The Russian soldiers and special forces and leaders are still there, and the question that we came up with answer to is how to get the Russians out. And again, these Russian and Ukrainians agreed on a way to do that, having to do with a United Nations peacekeeping operation that would go in. So we waited a little bit, came back, and this is the second part, Susan, of our work of how did we use what we came up with. And we wrote a little report, a couple of pages, and we took it to see the Secretary of State, who at the time was Secretary Tillerson. He's now gone. But we also went out to see the head of the CIA, Mr. Pompeo, who is still here but in a different office. We then went to see the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, who is now gone. But we subsequently have seen the new National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, John Bolton. So we have used these conversations and the results of these conversations to transfer the ideas and the proposals to the U.S. government. And it turns out we asked our Russian colleagues to do the same, and they have done so. They've given the same paper that we came up with in Berlin to the people in the Kremlin, and we're told that it's gotten to Mr. Putin. Same thing, of course, in Ukraine. Our Ukrainian colleagues took it to President Poroshenko, and so he has seen these proposals as well. The second time we met in February, we developed further the ideas that we come up with earlier. And then, as I say, did the same round of conversations back here in Washington to transfer the ideas that we'd come up with to the U.S. government. Our theory of change, and I will end here, Susan. Our theory of change is not that we're going to solve this. It's not USIP solving this conflict, but there is someone who might be able to solve the conflict. It's U.S. government together with the Russian government, the Ukrainian government. So our theory is if we can get smart people together who know this project, who know the conflict, who can speak off the record. That's the other thing I want to emphasize, is that we told all of our participants, all the Russians and Ukrainians and the other Americans, the French, the Germans, that we would not tell anyone. So you're all sworn to secrecy. You know, no talking about this outside of this room, because the Russians who were in the room were able, knowing that they wouldn't be identified and knowing that they wouldn't, their views, what they said would not be repeated back in Moscow, they were able to take some steps and make some proposals and agree to some things that they couldn't have done if it were public. If it were public, they'd be in real trouble because they went beyond what the official line was, the official Russian line. Same thing with the Ukrainians. And the reason it's important to maintain that confidentiality is that they came back. The second time we had this session, they came back, and had it been in the press after the first time, they wouldn't have come back. They said, "Oh, you guys, you violated the confidentiality agreement, so we're not going." So that's an important piece, and it gets to one of your questions, Susan Oge, about kind of the level of our participation being known or not. So, theory of change is if we can plow the ground, if track 2 dialogues can kind of plow the ground, come up with ideas that would otherwise not have come up with, to give to, and then we can advise the U.S. government, and in turn, they may be, the U.S. government, Russian government, Ukrainian government, may be able to come up with a way to solve that conflict. So.
Great. That's really helpful. I'd like to ask a follow-on question to that, and that is, I mean, it sounds to me like this was not a situation that was ripe for other partners to lead, and that USIP, being very uniquely positioned, had to play a really central role. And so maybe if I could just get you to draw out how was that determination made?
It's an excellent question, and I think you're exactly right. It's hard to see getting as far as we did with the level of participation that we had at the senior levels of Russians and Ukrainians without two things. One is Steve Hadley. I mean, let's be clear. Steve Hadley knows every senior person in all these governments. And when I called up, we divided up the responsibility. So I had the responsibilities for the Ukrainians, and John Herbst from the Atlantic Council had the responsibility for the Russians. And so when I called up the Ukrainians, and I said, Steve Hadley is wondering if you can join us in Berlin, they said, you bet. And the same thing when John Herbst called the Russians. So Steve is a really important piece of that. And the second piece is, it's USIP. And so they recognized that the Institute of Peace is, real close to the State Department, and that we've got people who have gone kind of back and forth between the government and USIP and have access and can transfer those ideas. If they come to Berlin, have this conversation, the Russians and Ukrainians said, maybe there's a chance that something real would come out of this discussion. And so they came.
So I think maybe when we go into the groups, this question about what is the role of critical individuals in our ability to deliver is important. I would argue that for the Nigeria program, the connection to the governors was partly because Ambassador Carson was known to them and could invite them. I will pick on Chris at some point to say, what was it that drew the members of the senior working group to agree to come together in a way that they haven't come together before, even though they share a common mission. But I want to turn to Sarhang now, because I think the Iraq program has taken a slightly different approach and worked through partners to influence policy. And I'm wondering if you can just outline a little bit of kind of the core problem that you're seeking to address, and why, what is the track towards policy influence?
Thank you. Great group, great discussion, and a true honor to be here. Well, let me take issue with your first word, influence. We had a debate about this within our team, and given USIP status, we chose not to use influence because influence suggests that you take a position and in a certain direction. So we use the word inform. So for the USIP side, for the partner side, the Iraqis that we've invested in their capacity, it is their choice. They are free. They don't have our legal limitation. They can use the word advocacy, influence, change, whatever. So that's their choice. So context in Iraq, the project I was asked to speak about is our experience with religious minorities in Iraq, the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities. And to put this in context, the journey of USIP with them started in 2010. In Iraq, as a country, from 2003, has been transitioning from a centralized state, from a dictatorship, to a country that is embarked on a democratic process, democratic institutions, and then this is a country that has diversity of ethnicities, of religion. So coming from a central state, then to a situation where different communities had different levels of power and representation in protecting their interest in the government. So the minorities, the Christians, probably about 5% of the population at the time, now less than 1% of the population, and that's a challenge. You have so Iraq has about a dozen religious and ethnic minorities. Probably the collective of those may not reach 10% of the population. So that was a challenge when in country you had big actors, Sunnis, Shia, Arabs, basically the predominant. So by 2010, it has become clear that the religious minorities cannot advance their needs based on numbers and votes. There has to be another way. And they have been complaining that the Iraqi government has not been listening and not taking care of them. And they have been complaining that the international community has not been responsive, including being very critical of the U.S. government. Sometimes, for the longest period of time, building a clinic was not possible. It's really neglected. So in that context, they came to USIP and said, how can you help us? And the help was to get all the different minority groups through a series of dialogues that produced two institutions. One, a parliamentary caucus that had 14 parliamentarians in that parliament session. And the second track was a coalition of civil society organizations, the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities. This was supposed to be the bridge that we have the community side and you have the policy side working with each other, influencing policy, legislation, funding projects, and lead to a result. So that was our intervention focused on creating the institution, giving them the technical assistance through guidance, strategic guidance, through training on specific areas, but also giving them some seed funds that they will go now put their acquired skills into action on those lanes, policy, legislation, participatory budgeting to get to the needs of the community, and also curriculum reform, so that you will get the Iraqi communities to know about the different minorities and about their interests. Because there was a lot of negative, what is the word I'm looking for? Stereotypes about how this group is worshiping devil, how this group is a traitor, and this and that. So there was a lot of stereotypes that needed to be corrected. So they started action on those tracks. And then ISIS happened. It turned the situation completely upside down, made their situation worse. And this is where it accelerated the drop of their population. So their very existence now became a threat in Iraq, not just being ignored and not being included. So if you like, I can pause here for any follow-up questions. So we continue to work on those terrains. They were, through their work, through methodical work, they were successful in influencing legislation, specific legislation. I can talk about that, and they really took matters into their own hand, and they show. I was very impressed that. As someone who has grown up under a dictatorship, I did not know what democracy means. I know what democracy means now, living in a country. You see it in the people, in the active citizenry, in the institutions. Growing up in Iraq, I dreamed of democracy without knowing what it is, how it works. And now, this group actually is a true embodiment of how democracy could work. So Iraq transitioning to a federal state, different levels of authority, a lot of misunderstandings, but civil society has earned a seat at the table, and we enabled that. So let me pause here.
Sarhang, thanks for outlining that. And I think the distinction between informing and influencing is really, really helpful. So I wanted to ask a follow-up. How does USIP then draw on the insights, the practice, the progress, the embodiment of a democracy that you talked about of our partners to then use that to inform U.S. policy? How do you make that connection between the influencing that our partners are doing and how we feed that into the informing role that USIP plays?
That's a great question. I think our thinking changed over the years. I mean, I inherited this program. At the time, most of the focus was that, okay, you empower the Iraqis and they will do their own thing. But as someone who has grown up, and I was born and raised and spent most of my life in Iraq, I can tell you, you just don't sow the seeds and something will come out of it. It does not work that way. So USIP, I think, stayed methodically engaged with the group in a coaching and mentoring mechanism and through the supporting of their functions. But by 2014, with the ISIS being a game changer and some other issues, we realized that just working through AIM is not enough. There has to be a USIP angle. So in all our meetings with the Iraqi officials, with the United Nations, with the policymakers here, members of Congress, we started to bring those issues and try to be ahead of the curve so that we inform the international side of things. We realize that the Iraqis alone cannot do it. The Iraqi government and the Kurdistan regional government with the minorities will still not be able to do it. The international element is important. So the international we enabled AIM to represent, to engage, and to be a credible source, but we also used our expertise, our connections to keep the conversation going. And there were moments where AIM was not listened to. In 2014, ISIS labeled every single Christian house in Mosul so that they would be targeted for killing and taking their property. The first pictures that came out of Mosul the same day, we conveyed to the State Department to inform the U.S. government. Obviously, I don't know what specific action that led to, but we were part of the sharing of information. And then it comes to ideas. There is this critical question that should you create a special province for the minorities in Iraq so that you provide protection, direct support, and all of that. We can't take that policy position, but we inform the thinking on that. The AIM different members of AIM have different views on that. Some say yes, some say no. But for USIP, we say, okay, if you create that entity, that province, Iraqi constitution allows that, but does it achieve the objective of security, of cultural preservation, of economic opportunity? If this could there are parts that are answers of yes, there are parts of answers that are no. So this has been an informing conversation just right before this meeting. I was meeting with one of their strongest advocates in the United States, a businessman who's advocating for them. He found some of the things that I told him about his community informative. So our expertise could inform policy thinking. We can leave influencing to the communities, but I think the role of USIP as USIP, its reputation, its credibility, its expertise is indispensable in the policy conversation. And if I make one strong comment on the role of who is carrying that message, I think that is an important one. There are messages that we have asked Steve Hadley to convey. There are messages that we have asked Nancy to convey. And there are messages that we are conveying as a team. I think a strong, respected advocate with the stature of Steve, Bill, or Nancy can get the other side to listen. But if you have the substance, you don't always guarantee that the other side will listen. We have examples where the other side, the policymaker, listens to our substance, but it's not always a guaranteed case.
Thanks, Sarhang. There's lots in there, the kind of recognizing the division of responsibilities, the message, the messenger, I think all really valuable points. Bill, I want to come back to you because I think one of the challenges in track 2 processes with former government officials is how is that connected to realities and communities? So I'm curious to hear what did you do in your process to connect it? And I understand that you're at the point of thinking about maybe transitioning to something that's a bit more community-based. And what did that, what sparked that kind of potential turning point?
So you're right, Susan, that we are, the track 2, feeding into the track 1, that is feeding into the government negotiations on this topic, it can only go so far. And that track 1 part has slowed down. The Russians had an election, and their negotiator might have been, there was some question about whether he was still going to be on the case. And the ball was in his court to come back to our negotiator, Ambassador Volker, Kurt Volker, for a next step, to put something on the table. So in that interim, in that lull, we have been doing some work. Charles North, Steve has helped, and Kathleen and others around the room. Thinking about how we could have a lower level dialogue, having kind of a grassroots dialogue, ideally across this line of contact. So Ukraine is now divided. There's a small portion that's controlled by the Russians and by Ukrainian separatists, and there's a line of contact across which many people die today. Weekly there are deaths, exchanges of fire. There's active, fighting going on. And the question is how to have a conversation, a dialogue, track 3, if you will, across that line, because the people living in the occupied territories put themselves in danger if they are seen talking to folks on the outside, even Ukrainians on the other side, even members of their family on the other side of the line. So it's a tricky question that we are developing. But in answer to your question, we think the idea here is if we can find a mechanism for that conversation across the line of contact, and then have some conversations that kind of lead to some confidence that we can raise some more interesting questions, that we might start off with non-political questions, and then ask some questions, if possible, about what would it be like if Ukraine were to be reunited. If the Russians were to leave, according to this plan that we booked out, how would you, people living on the other side, think of yourselves in terms of being Ukrainian? What's your relationship to the capital? Those kind of questions. And then feed those answers back into the track 1 through our track 2. So we're hoping to do the tried and true USIP top-down, bottom-up kind of stuff.
They're all complicated webs, right? We should have an art wall just with all the complex systems and arrows that we do in the various places. So before I turn it to the group, I wanted to ask one last set of questions for Oge and for Sarhang in particular, because I think this may be of interest as the Ukraine project moves forward. But I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about selection of how was the senior working group constituted, because I think that's an interesting story. And I remember you saying they weren't the people who we thought they were going to be. And then my second question is, I think more to Sarhang on in terms of sustainability. How do you think through this, and how do you structure the partnership, the coaching, the training, the input of technical support in a way that helps to foster sustainability but balances the role for USIP? So we'll do those 2 quick comments, and then we'll turn it to the group for maybe 5 minutes of questions, and then we will move into our group work. I don't know who wants to go first.
So with the selection of the working group, it was a process, but a process that was very well worth it because it helped us identify key individuals that not only commanded respect and attention in their communities, but also commanded the respect and the attention of policymakers in northern Nigeria. One of the things that we see in northern Nigeria, especially when we started this project, is that a lot of the policymakers and the state governors in Nigeria are closer to the British than they are to the US government. So there wasn't really a close relationship with US government officials. There were a few officials who had taken steps to reach out to them. So like Ambassador Carson when he was when he was Assistant Secretary of State, and some other individuals as well who they could who they recognized, but they didn't really know that much about. They didn't really interact per se with the U.S. government, unlike the other policymakers or state governors from the southern part of Nigeria. So it was really important for us to identify key leaders and key actors to constitute the working group in Nigeria who understood the process to some extent in the United States and also commanded the respect of the governors. So in 2016, when we went out there, we had convened, we brought together different civil society actors from across the country to help us start thinking through the process of who these individuals would be. And they came up with different names. I think we probably had about 20 names on the list that they came up with. And so we took these names, we brought these names back with us. And as we started reaching out to the governors as well to invite them to the symposium and also make them more aware of the project, we started realizing that some of the individuals on the list that were identified by some of the civil society actors may have some influence in the civil society space, but couldn't really impact the policy-making process. They were instrumental in leading voices of change in their communities, but then they were also in a space where some government officials didn't necessarily trust is not the right word, but some government officials didn't necessarily respect some of their views. So in the case of Nigeria, there's always been a tension between civil society and government, and so it was important to identify individuals that could be seen as neutral on both sides. So when we came back, we had a conversation with our colleagues on the LER team, and we actually came up with a process, a template, per se, with some key questions that we had identified based on our conversations with civil society actors, based on our conversations with the state governors. And we sent these questionnaires out to some of the individuals that we had identified on the list who we thought basically fit that mold where they could be identified as, they were regarded as neutral and independent. And we gave them the opportunity to respond to some of the questions. Some of them were open-ended questions and come back to and send them back to us. And it was clear that with the group that we got, it's a diverse group. It's made up of academics, someone who is former military, someone who comes from the diplomatic corps, someone who comes from the education sector. So all these individuals are all thinking about the same thing, are all passionate about bringing change to Nigeria and strengthening the democratic process in the country, but they've all been working in their own different groups and never really saw themselves coming together. So after we went through the questions and we were able to grade and score, we went back to these individuals and we asked them, what was the real drive for really for joining the group? What is your motivation for being a member of this working group? There is really no, there is no monetary compensation here in any way. What is the drive? So it was really helpful having those questionnaires from the very beginning and having them feed into the process of selection. And again, to your point about, after we had that meeting in 2016, again, we had 50 names on that list. And of the 50 names that were on that list, I think only 2 people from that list were identified after we had a second round of consultations with the state governors and several senior Nigerians as well.
Chris, did you know you'd been graded in the selection process? So Sarhang, maybe you can give us the kind of last word on the panel in terms of the question of sustainability across elections, particularly for a parliamentary caucus and for a corresponding civil society group.
Well, thank you. So for a lot of you may not know that I joined USIP in a monitoring and evaluation capacity. I was not hired to be a director or to be a conflict analyst. And three things I found problematic as I played that role. One is networking or coalition, creating a network or a coalition. Second, sustainability. And third, impact. On the network, some of this may be specific to the context of Iraq. Creating a network, so this is an institution, so an alliance is an institution, is one thing. For that alliance to deliver is something else for the needs of the people. So the alliance is a vehicle. And one of the things that in the case of the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities that worked, this was actually a network or a coalition that was started early on, delivering on the objective, while the organizational side of it to be sustainable lagged. So when this project was passed on to me, it was successful in meeting key objectives of curriculum reform, influencing policy, and engaging with the international community, but it lagged behind in self-administration. They could not organize a meeting. They could not take good notes. They could not plan an event and how much it cost, send invitations out. So I had to do some backfilling when it came to that. The question of sustainability, one of the things that I advise USIP, and that's why in North Africa you don't hear the network of Tunisian facilitators, because I told Manal at the time, who was my boss, that said, don't use network, don't make creating a network an objective, create addressing the objective of the need, which is conflict resolution, go after that objective, and in the process, if the capacity became a network, great, but don't make, because you could go and pursue that objective and forget about the original objective. The vehicle could take your time. So, and this is where it makes sustainability tricky. What are you making sustainable? How do you define sustainability? In none of the networks that we set up, when I joined USIP, that was defined. Different people had different definitions of what was supposed to be sustainable. And so having a clarity on that is really, really important, because sustainability has a organizational capacity in terms of who's the leader and the bylaw that dispute resolution within the institution. Fundraising is a key issue in terms of making that sustainable. And the grounds on which people have consensus on today, that brings them together, if that changes in 4 or 5 years' time, will that still be a convening factor for people for things to be sustainable? So that's a big challenge. One of the other things that we learned, we really need to be, at least meet them halfway in terms of fixing their problems, reforming the institutions to adjust for new challenges, political cycles. Some of those people go and become affiliated with this party, or they break away from that party. So the value of the participants change with election cycles. So it's really a dynamic thing that you have to stay with. And at the parliamentary level, this is one of the most difficult part, because people are in the Iraqi parliament to implement agendas of their party, not even their own agenda sometimes. And if the party agenda does not treat what you are dealing with as a priority, then that does not become a priority for them. Then, therefore, civil society may not be able to influence. This is where you have to go to the prime minister, you have to go to the national security advisor, you have to go to the other people to make sure that you tackle that from multiple layers.
Great. I think this panel probably could have been an hour in and of itself. So let me thank our panelists for their insights and for creating connections across projects that are addressing different issues, taking slightly different approaches. Before we turn to the group work, I do want to give Chris an opportunity to share any reflections on what you've heard, anything that you'd like to contribute in terms of the senior working group coming together, and then we'll shift to engaging the broader room.
That sounds good. I just want to take a quick pulse check, because since we didn't have a chance to really ask questions to the panel, would folks rather ask questions to the panel in the 20 minutes than remain, or have small group discussion? Could I get a show of hands who wants Q&A with the panel? Okay, so not too many, but so maybe you can engage them in small group work, and we can then continue that
Should we
way.
ask who wants small groups? Because maybe not everybody wants.
Who wants small groups? Why don't we then have a Q&A, a longer Q&A session? That way, because I do want to give folks a chance to ask questions, since we didn't really have much time, and it was such a good presentation and conversation. So why don't we shift a little bit the last 20 minutes so that we can get a little deeper on some of the points that were raised. Great.
Well, let's turn to Chris first, and maybe we can take questions and comments. And I'd encourage people in your questions, if you have thoughts to address the questions that Oge laid out, we can hopefully build those in. I think, is there a mic so that those on the phone can hear?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan, for this opportunity to reflect. I think basically it's about lessons learned and how we can consolidate on those lessons. And if there are other advice or recommendations, we look at how we also strengthen the program. I know the very first day we met here, the senior working group, Ambassador Carson said, there is power in your collective voices. And that singular statement was very important in terms of how each of the senior working group member was able to see himself as part of a drive that is meant to provide what is really needed to consolidate on the peace and then strengthen other efforts around peace building and conflict management. Beyond the engagement with the governors, increasingly the working group is becoming a strong bridge between the citizens and the policymakers. Because one key lesson we learned from the memo on the farmer header was that those things citizens were not able to see, the memo was able to capture. And the members of the senior working group were invited to also speak at a national security meeting that the National Assembly convened. Where some members of the group were invited. And from there, the ECOWAS meeting. So they were able to speak in ways that policymakers could understand. Even beyond the support that the senior working group was providing, the working group was also able to engage civil society organizations. We did what was called State of the Nation review about some of the emerging security threats in the country. And that particular memo got also to the presidency within 24 hours when we released it, apart from the one on ECOWAS. That's one of the impacts we see with what the senior working group is doing. And for me, I identify 4 things. The first is that they have a voice. Now, beyond having a voice, if you don't have a platform, it's possible you shout, no one listens. So
You are the
USIP
only participant in the conference. Please press any key on your keypad to remain in the conference.
So USIP was able to provide a platform. And in providing that platform, it was able to amplify the voices of the senior working group to make it more cohesive rather than allowing them to speak at that individual level that they were speaking in the past. Now with the voices, with the platform, they were able to make the needed influence in terms of their ability to engage the policymakers. Now we are here today because of the impact. And for me, that's the fourth layer of that continuum. They've been able to impact on the respective states. It might not be all the states because each governor is also unique in terms of his own behavior, in terms of how he views things. But there are progressive-minded governors amongst them. Kaduna is one of them. It's becoming a model. Plateau started, and we can count several of them that have been able to push through with several of the issues that we discussed from the very first day we met here. So I think it's, if the Nigerian model on how we can harness and invest in the powers and skills of critical stakeholders within a society works, it's something that other countries can really learn in terms of how we bridge the gulf that exists between citizens and the policy makers, because the gulf is so wide. And if you don't have the right bridge in terms of individuals that have the credibility, that have the ability to really understand the nuances in terms of what the issues are. Because sometimes you might identify someone you call a bridge builder, but the policymaker might not see him or her as the right person to engage. And that's why the process that Oye talked about in terms of identifying, because when you identify people who have vested interest in the whole process, for instance, in dealing with a governor, if the governor is seeking re-election and you are presenting to him someone that has interest in the governorship or is supporting somebody that he knows, certainly that governor will not be willing to open up the space for you to engage. So we've been able to walk through that process to ensure that we keep to the vision in terms of what the theory of change was, so that we achieve what USIP sought to achieve. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Let's open it up for questions. We'll take a series of 3 or 4, and then we can turn back to the table or the group to draw those out. So I see Ryan has his hand up first. I'm going to take one from each table, and Kathleen, Ezra, it's our first round.
Thanks very much. This is working. Great. Thank you for the great presentations. It was really interesting, and especially to hear, the across different projects, which we don't always, sort of focus on. And that's sort of part of my question, is thinking about the distinct approaches taken in these different conflicts. Obviously, the context is greatly different, but also just sort of how we match approach to situation. For instance, I mean, in a track 2 situation, we're by definition going to actors that are, biased. They have their own agendas, and we're trying to match those to each other and come up with some compromise. In the case of Iraq, we were attempting, we went directly to the interested party, which was the minorities, and said, we want to help you advocate, essentially. I mean, they advocate, we try to build their capacity. But then in the case of Nigeria, it seems I guess my first question is to try to confirm this. It seems that we intentionally avoided parties that are involved in sort of the active conflicts that we're looking at. It's not a track 2 between farmers and pastoralists, and with members on both sides, for instance. I think you mentioned that it was you intentionally asked questions about objectivity as being a higher priority to get to, I suppose, some higher level problem if we identify governance as the issue. And so I guess it's just maybe as much of a comment as a question that we seem to choose different sort of entry points, and it's just sort of it would be an interesting exercise to understand why, or whether it's simply determined as the easiest method at that time or just the right approach. So that's my comment.
Great. hopefully it's the most effective, not the easiest method, but Kathleen.
I wanted to respond to Oge's comment, what other relevant comparative experiences, and just signal, I thought, Sarhang's comment about not to confuse the means with the end. I thought that's very important, and your advice to Manal, like, let's not make our objective the network. Let's identify the objective and then figure out the right vehicle, I think. Very important. I think we sometimes lose that focus, and I think we need to be reminded as we're learning. But in terms of comparative experiences, and I was looking around to see if anybody from Rose's team is here, but certainly the Columbia peace processes, working with namely the work of Jenny Bouvier, I think is one that we could bring into this conversation. If we were going to actually write something up, I would encourage us, because they were definitely into influencing policy to make sure women's issues and women's voices were a part of the peace process. And the second one, which is much more local, but I think is illustrative at the same time, is 8 years ago, USIP set up as a secretariat the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security to play that intermediary role between civil society, which has a lot of on-the-ground experience on women, peace, and security, and with our U.S. government, which was just beginning to look at a national action plan. That working group still meets monthly and now is focused on the new 2017 Women, Peace, and Security Act. So that's longevity. It is an alliance, but I think it is also another one of those examples of convening and how we play that interlocutor role.
Kathleen may have just won herself a ticket to Nigeria. Ezra.
I can relate to that comparative example as well, and one of the work that the groups that I'm familiar with of water scientists forming a joint sort of working group, and they have been very effective during the Oslo peace process in terms of influencing the management of underground water in Israel and Palestine. And they a lot of their ideas, and they worked for many years together, Israeli and Palestinian water scientists, and they came up with different mechanisms of water management. And some of these ideas were adopted in the 1995 Oslo negotiations and was transferred into a joint body called the Joint Water Committee. So that is one of the successful examples that I know. I mean, of course, the the rest of the story we all know, but Joint Water Committee was one of the few functioning bodies, joint bodies, even after the Second Intifada broke. So it's actually an interesting, it's a similar idea. It was more a technical working group, not like the one that you're doing, but specifically looking into water issues and water management and water conflict. But it was a very successful example in that sense. My question is about. Actually, it's I see that as a common thread in all these three projects, is about what do you expect to see, or have you experienced any asymmetrical policy impact, and how do you think or how do you think you will deal with that? And this is something that I see in projects like this. So what I mean by that, what I mean by asymmetrical impact or asymmetrical transfer is, so for example, in the Ukrainian context,
some of these ideas make impact on one side, let's say the Ukrainian side, but not on the Russian side. So you see some change occurring on one side, but not the other side. Or you mentioned Kaguna, that this is becoming a model in Kaguna, so that this is becoming a model, a very successful one adopted in one state, but not in other states, for example. What do you think about this sort of more asymmetrical kind of impact? And I think the question can be also extended to the Iraq example.
Okay. So let's take a quick round of responses, and then if we can, I'd like to go back and take a couple of last questions. So I beg you to be as succinct as you possibly can.
I'll be very succinct. I think Ryan's got a really good point. These are three different approaches for three different purposes. I mean, the purpose on the Ukraine-Russia was to try to find a solution to the conflict. So we did have people on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, and so we did have people on opposite sides of the. It's a little different. You guys can talk about the Iraq and the Nigeria one, but the working group is clearly a different, for a different purpose on that thing. Ezra, on asymmetrical impact, it's early, but what we know is it's a fairly symmetrical impact in that the proposals that we came up with jointly and agreed to in Berlin in 2 sessions have influenced all three governments. All three governments have begun to examine those, and indeed even adopt pieces of them. The mechanisms are less important than the fact that they're agreed by at least some senior Russians and some senior Ukrainians that have some influence in their capitals, and similarly in the United States. So far it hadn't gotten very far, so it's symmetrical in that regard, but it is good.
Yes, very quickly on the choice of the methodology. I mean, in Iraq at that point, when this particular round of working with the minorities was done, I mean, there was the U.S. engagement was deep, the international engagement was deep, so different things were tried. And in the specific case of the minorities, there has been several coalition-building attempts that have not resulted. This provided a new experiment that half of it continued the civil society, and in all our training and work and capacity building, the civil society part seems to go faster, become more effective, more sustainable. So that is one aspect. Quickly to the point on ends and means. I want to, so my stress, this is something to make sure I can clarify, was not to get lost in the means and forget about the ends, but the means is also important. I think you constantly need to check if the means that you have chosen leads you to the ends that you want to reach. And there was plenty that I dealt with at USIP that did not meet that check, and we've done a lot of revisions. And if you are interested in a more detailed look at Michael Zanchelli and the LER team shepherded 2 specific evaluations related to the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities from which lessons could be extracted. On the asymmetrical policy impact, I think so far it's difficult to answer in the Iraq context because you can point to a lot of successes in terms of a coalition was set up, they have done good work, it led to projects, change in legislation, and all of that. But if you really take a giant step back and look at the big picture, the Christians in Iraq will tell you we were 1.5 million people in 2003. We are between 100,000 to 200,000 in 2018. So the effectiveness of what we do was not targeted necessarily at preventing that drop. It was helping them to in other ways, but the international community, members of Congress, when they weigh the impact, they may choose different indicators. And that is a big challenge in Iraq. What has been done, and how do you evaluate the impact on any side of that issue? That's a big challenge.
I think to Ryan's question about the approach, one of the things that we saw in Nigeria when we engaged was that we tried to find the most effective route to address the drivers of conflict in looking at a specific conflict in Nigeria, looking at the Boko Haram crisis. There were already a lot of actors in the space. There were folks working on the civil society side, and there were folks working on the to some extent on the government side, but mostly focused at the national level. And it was important for us to think about how we could be effective in this space and what role individuals at the state level, especially those policymakers at the state level, could play to addressing these issues quickly or to addressing these issues effectively. One of the things that we found out before we even started the engagement was that a lot of the civic actors, civil society groups that were engaging in some of these states hadn't even had any face time with the governors, had never met with them. We also saw that the US government, the embassy and USAID at the time, as they were engaging in Nigeria, a lot of embassy staff weren't able to travel up to northeast Nigeria. So they were basing a lot of their programs and projects based on reports that were coming to them from the region. So it was important for us to think about an effective approach and an effective way to engage policymakers in this space. And I think one of the things that came out from us convening the governors together in 2016 was they were able to get this face time with USAID, with the State Department, with the White House and others when they were here in Washington, D.C. And that one-on-one discussion that they had with them actually led to USAID in Nigeria sort of changing their direction and their approach in looking at how they address the issues surrounding Boko Haram, especially at the state level, and leading them to increase their engagement and interaction with state governors in Nigeria. Kathleen left. And I think the examples that she raised, I'm going to follow up with Kathleen on that because, as I mentioned, the working group is in the process of developing their strategic plan. And this isn't your traditional organization per se. It wasn't created to be, or the group, they weren't brought together to be an organization. So lessons from others will be very helpful. And to the last point, if I can, in like 1 minute or less. I think what we've seen in the case of Nigeria is that a lot of our engagement, what we've done, and I certainly agree with Sahang's point, it's still early days of a project in Nigeria, but a lot of our engagement has really been with the governors and at the forum level. So when we engage, the working group engages with all the governors, and it's really up to those governors to, as the message trickles down, they implement at the state level. So we try to ensure that we engage at that forum level where all the governors sit, and we bring out they collectively identify what the key policy issues are, and are able to hold themselves accountable.
Well, my apologies. I don't think we're going to be able to do another round, but I want to thank our panelists for everybody for coming today. And I hope if you have other questions or inputs, I know that we would be happy to receive them. And thank you again to Christiane and her team for organizing this and making it possible.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. If I can just ask before you leave, there's an evaluation at the tables. Please fill it out. It's quick. It's just to have some feedback and to know how we can improve these sessions and make them more useful to you all. So thank you again for coming. Look forward to our next Learning Exchange. Have a good afternoon.